So welcome to our 20 minutes from the future. Today we are with Michele Wucker, and I'm very, very honored and happy to be welcoming her to our webinar online. She has been applying for 3 decades, experience in media, finance, and no-profit management, content creation, and she used that helping decision makers to take a fresh look at and also improve their strategies for confronting with a very special topic that is, I think, very important, mainly should be very important always, but right now is also a very current topic, because she helps them to confront obvious but under-addressed business and policy challenges. And so we will see why obvious but not well-addressed problems are right now very important to understand. In fact, her latest book is called The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. And it was published in April 2016. And as I said, right now is very current because the pandemic, of course, is a great example of the Gray Rhino, but we will get to know more about it. She's also a fellow young global leader of the World Economic Forum. She's there from 2009. So that is also why I'm more and more happy to be able to have her join us here, because it's a community from which I really get a lot. And I'm happy to share what I can get from this community with you all. So welcome, Michele.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you.
As I said, our first question will be about gray rhinos, so that we can understand a little bit more about what they are and why they are so important right now in this period. So this is one of your focus. And as we mentioned, a gray rhino is an obvious danger that somehow, you will explain a little bit more why, we tend to ignore. So can you tell us a little bit more about these strange animals and also how they differ from black swans, which are also another animal that has been mentioned a lot in this period?
Sure, absolutely. Well, during the financial crisis in 2008, a book came out about black swans. And the idea was that in Europe, everybody thought swans were white. And so they couldn't imagine something, a black swan, which of course existed. And so the point of that metaphor was to say, hey, there are things out there that you can't even think of that are going to come up and sideswipe you. So just need to be aware that something you can't predict is going to be a problem. And so what happens after 2008, everybody, anytime they saw anything bad happen, said, oh, black swan, nobody could have seen it coming. It was unpredictable. It was impossible. But in 2008, there were so many people warning about problems in the subprime market, warning about asset bubbles. I had an apartment in New York City that I had bought in 2000 that in 4 years nearly doubled in value. And if you couldn't see that there was something wrong with that, you were really not looking. So my background was in finance, and I wrote in 2001 about the Argentinian financial collapse and some efforts about 9 months earlier to try to do a restructuring and debt reduction that would help to prevent a bigger crisis. And that, of course, didn't happen, and Argentina collapsed and investors lost 70% of their money. It was a big mess. So 10 years later, I saw what was happening in Greece, similar debt going up, economy going down. This was not going to end well. So I wrote a paper in 2011 that said, hey, Greece needs to learn from Argentina. Its creditors need to learn from Argentina. Sit down and figure something out. And it took a long time. It was, it was hard, but they actually did come to an agreement. So that got me really thinking, what's the difference? They both saw a big, scary thing coming at them. And Argentina ignored it, and Greece dealt with it. So what makes the difference? So I was trying to find a way to talk about that wasn't all about sovereign credit spreads and boring financial things that most people aren't interested in, and was talking to a friend, and it was this picture of, the big scary thing coming at you. The image came into my head of the horn and then the rhino. And even though the idea developed separately from the black swan, this friend made a black swan joke. He's like, "Oh, well, you could call it a black rhino." And of course, I had seen rhinos in the zoo when I was 6 years old. And I thought, wait a minute, there actually is something in real life called a black rhino. But isn't there also a white rhino? Let me go to Wikipedia because I don't remember from the sixth grade. And that's when I discovered that black rhinos, which is a species, are not black. White rhinos are not white. They're all gray. So it seemed to me to be a perfect way to reinforce this metaphor for the obvious thing that's not getting talked about, or it is getting talked about, but it's not being dealt with. There's another animal, the elephant in the room, which by definition nobody does or says anything about it. And when people talk about it, they kind of nod their head and say, "Oh yeah, well, nobody's ever going to do anything about that." And I thought that accepted things that we shouldn't accept. That the rhino is something it's coming at you, that you really have a choice. You need to do something about it. And in many cases, people are talking, many people are doing things. With the pandemic, you look at so many warnings that we were going to be seeing another pandemic, that the world wasn't ready. The World Health Organization, Bill Gates, so many warnings that people ignored. And then when it came out in China, and people saw what was happening in China, then people saw what was happening in Italy, in the United States. People saw that happening, and there were some cases already in the United States that people refused to accept that it was coming. And so we were very, very slow in getting personal protective equipment, in getting masks, in putting in place shelter-in-place orders. And so that's why you see the United States comparing very, very poorly to other countries. Is we had this gray rhino first when it was far away, and then when it was up close. And in both cases, we missed the opportunity to deal with it. And I think people are realizing the cost of that right now. So I think that's why the gray rhino is in the news again, because it really touches something that people are very concerned about.
Yes, and also it could be actually a good opportunity, because usually when there is a pandemic, there are two ways to react after the pandemic. So sometimes we just tend to um, restart our lives and start not to think about what happened. So we don't sit and think about, we don't debrief, and we don't learn actually. So we tend to try to do that. Of course, it's a temptation, because after a long period of suffering and also being distant and so on, of course you want to forget. But it could be a great opportunity this time to really start doing the other thing. So learn and try to understand what we can do better. And in order to do that, of course, one of the first things to understand, that is explained also in your book, is why does this happen? So what are the main reasons we are not able to be fully aware of something that is so obvious, that is there in front of us? Why don't we act correctly?
It's such a good question, and it's why we look back at past situations to learn from them and move forward, instead of the black swan, where the point is to look back and just avoid any responsibility for it. Part of the problem is that we have human defense mechanisms in our mind that help us from being overwhelmed. And sometimes if we recognize the full magnitude of something, it's just overwhelming and it crushes us. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has written about this in talking about death and dying and grief, that the initial stages of grief it's denial, because you just can't get your head around it. And that's our brain protecting us. But if you stay in that mode for too long, it becomes dangerous. And we see actually one of the problems with the virus. They're arguing that one of the issues is that it's not just the virus; it's the immune system response. So that some of our defense mechanisms can turn on us. And the very thing that's supposed to protect denial in these defense mechanisms. Um, and a lot of people, interestingly, particularly in the United States, where we all like to think that, well, we're Americans, so if something's obvious, well, we're dealing with it and we know what to do, and we're better than all the other countries, and we're not going to learn from them, which as you can tell, I don't agree with. But people get very defensive about this idea that we don't see the most obvious thing. But I think the first step is to really recognize how vulnerable that we are to doing that. So you have the cognitive side of it. Then you have decision-making dynamics. Whereas, when you're in a group, particularly when everybody's very similar to each other, everybody listens to what the first person says, or, the richest or most powerful or tallest person says. And people become very hesitant to say things that people don't want to hear. So there's a decision-making dynamic there. And I think you need to think about how it is, even in your personal life. I was talking yesterday to my best friend. I'm very, very lucky that she's the kind of best friend who says things that I don't want to hear. And she's often right. And, everybody needs a best friend like that. Or if it's a board of directors at a company, you need people who are going to say the things that people don't want to hear, because that protects you from getting hurt by them. And then the other part is this, short-term versus long-term orientation. There are a lot of things like climate change, which of course is accelerating now, and it's very much here. And so that in many ways is becoming a short-term challenge. But for so long, people thought, oh, that's so far in the future. I'm going to worry about things right in front of me right now, and I'll deal with that when I have to. And the problem is that when things are far away is when they cost less to fix, and when you're much more likely to be successful. But if you wait till it's right on top of you, there's going to be damage that's done. It's going to be much more expensive. It's going to be harder. It's like in the book I wrote about a bridge collapse in Minnesota. And one of the points was that to fix something when it's just like a disaster, it costs more to get contractors, because they know that you have to do it, so they'll push their prices up. It's disruptive. You can't plan on which streets you're going to close and things like that. So it costs that much more to wait until the last minute. And some cultures are better at looking long term than others, and some political systems are better at looking long term than others. The sort of more technocratic cultures, the people who actually think about policy and where the leadership listens to them and actually does something about it, those are the countries that are going to do better in dealing with all sorts of gray rhinos.
Right. So you were also talking about stages in the cognitive problem of why we don't see a gray rhino. So you were talking about, of course, grief and stages in grief, but you also detected 5 stages with a gray rhino in your book. So can you just mention the 5 stages, and also maybe comparing on what happened in the recent pandemic, so that it could be also easier to follow and understand how they work?
Sure. Well, I came up with the 5 stages as a way to help people think about how to deal with one of these gray rhinos, because people react in different ways at different stages, and so there are different obstacles to dealing with it, and there are different strategies for fixing it. And the first one, obviously, is, as I mentioned, is denial. That's when you're just like, la 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 la, I don't want to hear about it. Ignore that it exists. The second one is muddling, where you say, yeah, the problem exists, but I can't do it because I don't have the budget. My boss doesn't agree. There's no political will. Oh, I'd rather buy a new car. Come up with lots of reasons not to do with it. The third one is what I call diagnosing. And it's where you shift from this why I can't do it mode to what does it take to solve the problem. And so that's when you're looking at, who do I need to help me? What resources do I need? How do I get them? You also do sort of an analysis of the people who are affected by this, because they're often going to be in different parts of stages. Some of them might still be in denial. Some of them might be ahead and they're already going ahead and doing something. And then you also analyze how closely connected a gray rhino is to other ones. There's been a lot of talk about the connections between the pandemic and climate change. That in areas with higher pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions, people have much poorer responses because their lungs are compromised, and there are other viruses that are emerging because the permafrost in the Arctic is thawing and releasing these new pathogens that are thousands of years old. So diagnosing is really when you're coming up with the plan and figuring out what to do. Panic is the fourth stage. It's what it sounds like. Everybody's running around screaming, do something, anybody, just do something. I was thinking of the painting The Scream by Edvard Munch, the Norwegian artist. And that's the time when you're more likely to do something. But if you haven't really thought through the problem, or if you don't have people who have a good plan, you're more likely to do the wrong thing. Which is, like the United States, for example, there were many plans, even a scenario plan last year about what to do about a pandemic. So they actually had the plan, but they didn't even look at it, which is ridiculous. Which is, a characteristic of the panic stage. You do the wrong thing. And then finally, action. Usually a small group of people are starting to act, and what you want to do is add to that group, make it as big as possible. And then you want to track what you're doing. Too many people will say, hey, here's the problem, and okay, this is what I'm going to do. They do it, and they don't stop to check back as to whether it works or not. And so you do need to adjust things. Sometimes you need to touch base every 6 months, once a year, however long, just to make sure that the same thing isn't coming back again. I like to talk about when you go to the dentist and they clean your teeth and they feel so nice. And you're really, really good about flossing your teeth and doing everything they say for like the first couple days. And then you slack off a little bit more. And by the next time you go to the dentist, you get yelled at again for not flossing enough. So that same thing applies to all sorts of other problems, is that there are some things where you can't just do one thing and it's solved. You need to make habits out of dealing with it on a regular basis.
So how do we create those habits? Because you already mentioned before that there are some systems, for example, some countries where it's easier to have a long-term view and so also to probably have a plan in action and start acting before others. So how do we design a system that works better in order to be able to look directly to a gray rhino and just don't panic?
Great system. And in countries like democracies that have fairly short political cycles, maybe you find a way to detach some decisions from that. You create more of a technocratic culture, long-term appointments. In the US, we have, Supreme Court who are, they're appointed and then they're there. And I think that there are some long-term issues, or we really could use people who are not affected by political cycles. Budgeting, companies, they have the capital expenditures budget and they've got the operating expenses. When countries are making their budgets, make sure that there's money in there for some of the long-term issues. And the other part has to do with, with really citizens. It's not just something the government needs to do, but with citizens' expectations. You hear so many people trying to sound, very wise by saying, oh, that's never going to happen because blah, blah, blah. And instead they need to be saying, here's a politician who made a really difficult decision and needs to be celebrated for it. And here's someone who saw the big bad thing coming and didn't do anything. Well, their legacy is not going to look good. In the States, we've got the Profiles in Political Courage Awards, that the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Center awards. And one of the ones that I think of a lot is George H.W. Bush, the father, who hiked taxes near the end of his term because he saw the math. It's what needed to be done. And a lot of people blame him not being reelected on that. I don't actually think that's the case. I think it was just that the economy was already slowing and it was an economic cycle thing. But we need to get in the habit of rewarding people who make those tough decisions. And that's a very hard thing to do because humans are very, very bad at counterfactuals, at imagining what might have happened. And we see this with the pandemic too. People are saying, oh, we'll see, hospitals aren't overwhelmed, so why did we go through all this? I'm like, well, we did the shelter in place so that the hospitals wouldn't be overwhelmed. But people don't think like that. So we really need a mindset change on many different levels.
Yes, you're right. And also the reward, because of course we somehow work based on the rewards we get. And it's not easy to get a reward on something if it's something that other generations will be rewarded because you did the right thing. So it's quite difficult. So it also brings us to the next question that I had, because you already mentioned the citizens, the general public, who should be more involved in this kind of global challenges and big gray rhinos that are in front of us. And so what do you think about the role of the media in this? Could they help in creating more awareness in the citizens? And if you had the power to do something, for instance, we are a magazine, we are communicating to a lot of people. So what's the message that should go out there, and how would you manage to do that?
Well, the media are so important in helping to frame what's going on, what people should be afraid of, what they shouldn't be afraid of. And I started my career as a journalist, and we always used to say, if it bleeds, it leads. The gory things, the emotionally salient things are the things that go up there. And there's a lot of pressure financially on the media these days. And they're not spending enough time on some of these big global issues. They tend to, in the United States, they tend to put things into a sort of like political horse race, put everything into a political context. And I think that really needs to change. And some of that might really involve rethinking the structure of the media. When media is so profit driven, they want to get the eyeballs. That's how the 2016 election happened the way it did, is that whoever says the most dramatic or outrageous thing gets the most media time, and then gets the most recognition, and then gets the most votes. And that's not healthy. It's not healthy at all for a society. So the media really needs to do a better job of putting things in context, to do more what they call service journalism, to get the right information out there. If they have a story about a plane crash, then put it into context. Well, hey, yeah, a lot more people die from not wearing seatbelts than from being in a plane crash. And we saw very politicized coverage of the pandemic in the United States. So, the media really needs to step back and be much more responsible about telling you what the risks are, not just because one political party or the other said it.
Yes, I completely agree. And as you said, we need really to rethink the way it works, because otherwise, if you live on advertising and those things, it's difficult to really be completely independent in this way. And actually, before going to the next question, I got a question that is quite related to what you were talking about. Because we have Carla that from YouTube is asking if we can define the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a gray rhino, and what would you keep an eye on in the world of technology, if not this, but something else?
Yeah, well, it's interesting since, Cambridge Analytica, the particular scandal happened in the past. And I get asked a lot, was this a gray rhino or a black swan? And I often avoid the question, because the black swan you can only see behind you, and the gray rhino you can see in front of you. I think that I think that some people were very likely warning about Cambridge Analytica, and I think that with what we know now, political manipulation of data is a huge issue, definitely a gray rhino going forward. And I think the Cambridge Analytica problem made that visible to many, many more people. The thing about gray rhinos is that they look different for everybody, partly because something might be more important to one person, or they're different in different countries or places. Clearly, for the pandemic experts, this was a huge gray rhino. For people who don't pay attention every day, well, okay, that's maybe not the biggest thing for them, but the people who made the decisions, above the pandemic people, certainly should have recognized it. But yeah, this is manipulation of data, spreading of false information. The World Health Organization actually called it an infodemic when all of this crazy information was going around about the pandemic, that if you sip water every 15 minutes, it's going to wash the virus down to your stomach, where the stomach acid kills it. So it's a great question, and it's a great it's a great example. Just saying, we use it for looking forward. Some people say, well, you just want to say, I told you so. And I said, no, there are examples from the past that I need to use to help to illustrate how something works. But this concept is really, really meant to be used looking forward and not backwards.
Right. Thank you. And I also have another question, and I will add something to my question that is coming from Dario, because they are also related. So my question is about what do you think we need to do in order to be able in the future to focus more. So we already talked about redesigning the system and changing our mindset, but what is the thing that you think is the most needed in order to make this kind of shift? And actually, Dario from Instagram is asking if you can give us some example of collaborative actions that we can do in order to face this kind of events. So I think they are quite related, because probably is also a collaborative action that we need in order to solve. But I leave to you the answer.
Absolutely. Well, I think that on top of the mindset shift, and I think this is part of it, is this idea that you can make a difference. It drives me crazy reading articles about climate change, because there's this whole set of articles right now saying, well, don't bother to change your diet. Don't bother to switch to, hybrid or public transportation. Don't become less wasteful, because if individuals do all this stuff, it's taking the responsibility off of the corporations, governments, who need to be doing stuff. And yeah, they need to be doing stuff too, but everybody needs to be doing it. And so to be going out and telling people that they're stupid for doing what it is that they can do makes my head want to explode. I'm so angry about it. There's a recent study by RARE, Center for Climate and Behavioral Economics. I'm sure I'm getting that slightly wrong, but where they looked at 30 behavioral solutions that Project Drawdown has identified for climate change. So this is things where just changing your behavior day to day. And they said that they identified a range of the impact on greenhouse gases that could have. And it was between 20%, a plausible number of people adopting it, to, I believe it was 37%. So if every individual on the planet does what they can to change their behavior, that's almost 40% of greenhouse gases. That's amazing. And so realizing that everybody can do their part, and asking yourself, if I knew this was coming and I didn't do my part, how would I feel about that? So on the big global issues, and even on this, pandemic, which, is of course global, but it's also got a very strong local element. One of the biggest things that worries me right now is that we're such an interdependent world, and countries need to be working together. And whenever there's an economic depression, it's too common for countries to turn into themselves, to become nationalist, to, beggar thy neighbor. and to sometimes even start conflicts to distract their citizens' attention from the fact that their leaders screwed up. So there's actually a new movement that started in the U.S., but many countries they're adding more every day. So I'm sure that whatever number I give you today would be out of doubt. But it's called One Shared World, and you can find it online at oneshared.world. And there's a declaration of interdependence, which is how important it is for countries to work together, and a pledge of interdependence that you can go to the website and sign very quickly. Basically, affirming how important this principle is, and that citizens need to make sure that their governments are aware of that, and to do whatever they can to act in support of those principles. Because I think if countries don't work together right now on pandemics and economic issues, we're going to end up in a very, very bad place. And we saw this with the Great Depression and the Second World War, which were the result of countries turning inwards and ignoring the fact that if other countries do better, then they will as well, that it's not a zero-sum game.
Right, I will surely have a look at this, and we can also post the link in the comments online so that everybody can have a look at the website. And yes, I agree. We should really understand that we are citizens of a planet and not only citizen of a country or a city. So we have so many dimensions as a planet. We should work together on global and very challenging issues. Otherwise, it's impossible actually to to face them, because if one country is not working together with the others, then it doesn't work. So it's very important. And climate change probably is one of the most critical challenges that we have right now. And I really hope, as I think everybody who is following us today, that we can learn also from the pandemic lesson, which was only a very small thing compared to what we can expect from climate change, and so start acting differently from today. So, well, thank you very much, Michele. It was very, very nice to talk with you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I will leave you to your lunch, I believe, because we have different hours. We are near to the dinner here in Italy. So, and so, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been absolutely a pleasure chatting with you.
My pleasure. And also for our followers, I just remembered the next webinars. The first one will be tomorrow at the same time, so 5 p.m. with Emiliano Ippoliti, and we will talk about finance and the future. And you probably will find out that there are so many similarities to what we are talking about the need to adopt a long-term view, which is, of course, very difficult to have in finance today. And then we will have on Thursday, Davide Sola, with whom we will talk about new business models after the coronavirus crisis. So thank you very much, everyone, for following us, and see you very soon.